Okay, so we're going to start, and as people log in, I just want to welcome everybody. So my name is Charles Small. I'm the director of ISGAP, and I'm speaking to you from England. I'm based here, and it's our honor and privilege to be able to introduce you to Natan Sharansky. As people are logging in, I'll just say very quickly that we have a seminar series. It will continue. On Wednesday, we have Arnon Gross and David Bodine. They'll be speaking about UNRWA and issues of education and anti-Semitism. We have Professor Dina Parat, who will be speaking on June the 8th, next Monday. And we have Jacques Gauthier, who's a lawyer and a historian, will be speaking on the 10th of June. So the seminar series will continue. And we're in the midst of trying to create a conversation for Thursday of this week on the situation in the United States, on issues of racism and how it relates to issues of anti-Semitism. So please stay tuned for that. So today it's really a privilege to have Natan with us. The title of Natan's speech today, seminar, is The 3Ds and the IHRA Definition, Tools to Combat Anti-Semitism. As many of you know, Natan Sharansky is a leading figure in the Jewish world and in Israel. He became the chair of ISGAP recently, which is a great honor for my colleagues and myself. And it's a privilege to work with Natan. As you know, Natan has literally dedicated his life to the Jewish people and to issues of human rights. He was a dissident in the Soviet Union and fought for the freedom of the Jewish people to be able to leave the Soviet Union. And he spent 9 years in a Soviet prison for his work on fighting for human rights. Upon his release from the Soviet Union, and due in part to the hard work of a worldwide coalition, mainly in the Jewish community, of fighting for the rights of the Soviet Jews to be free, Natan made Aliyah to Israel, and he there spent another 9 years in Israeli politics with the goal of helping his fellow Soviet Jews to integrate into Israeli society. After leaving politics, Natan became the head of the Jewish Agency, a position he held for 9 years. And as many of you know, Natan is the author of 3 important books and has received many awards and accolades over the years for his efforts in human rights. And he's a winner, as many of you know, of the Congressional Medal of Freedom. In a few months, Natan's book, Never Alone, which will review his work for the Jewish people, his 9 years in prison, his 9 years working in politics, and 9 years with the Jewish Agency, will be covered in the new book called Never Alone, which you can pre-order now on Amazon. And it will deal with, in part, with contemporary issues like the demonization of Israel and contemporary anti-Semitism and the challenges that we face in universities. So Natan will speak for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll be able to open it up for a conversation. So Natan, thank you very much for your time and joining us today.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everybody. I'm really honored to have another opportunity to speak about new anti-Semitism, this time from the platform of ISGAP, that I'm very glad and very honored to be a chairman of. Dear friends, formally, IHRA definition was approved by this organization in 2016, and since then a number of countries approved it as their official working definition of anti-Semitism. And practically with every step, in every country, there's debate that what a strange, is it really a definition? What a strange definition is definition together with examples which are explaining it, and why it is International Holocaust Remembrance Association, which is defining what is anti-Semitism. And the most important question, which causes a lot of criticism, is why there is attempt to make a connection between anti-Semitism and critical attitude towards Israel. Is it good for the freedom of speech? who said that scientific or academical discussion about the right of Israel to exist should be declared anti-Semitism. And in fact, all these debates remind me how this definition was born and when it was born and how it was born. And it was born in the debates between 2001 and 2004 and officially appeared first time in 2005. And it's worth looking on those debates and how it appeared to understand why it is such an important tool and why it not only doesn't restrict the freedom of speech, it gives a good platform for everybody, those who like Israel, those who hate Israel. But mainly it gives us a tool to fight against this awful hatred towards Jewish people and Jewish state. So let's take you to the events which were happening when the idea of this definition was discussed and when I came with my principle of 3Ds. First of all, it was Durban Conference. If you remember, 2000, after there was a big conference prepared for many years, thoroughly prepared during debates in different committees of the United Nations, Conference of the Global Races. And in fact, Israel was not ready, didn't expect that suddenly this conference on the world racism will turn into unique attack on Israel. Suddenly there was no difference between the word racism and the word Zionism. There was only one country which was targeted. Well, the truth has to be said, there was one person, Irving Kotler, the lawyer from Canada, and outstanding lawyer from Canada, who was warning for years. He was coming to Israel, and I was the witness how he tried to warn Israeli diplomats and Israeli politicians that something very unusual is preparing, that the huge attack on Israel under the pretext of the races. And some people, when it did happen, I heard some people were saying, well, look, after all, we survived 1975, when the United Nations passed a resolution that Zionism is racist, we'll survive this. But there was one big difference, and as the one who remembered very well 1975 in Moscow, what it meant then for us, how problematic it was. And now, when I was already Israeli politician, I could see the difference. The difference was that in 1975, it was all between the communist bloc and non-democratic countries of the Middle East and the Third World, which or hated Israel or had some built-in interest to support Soviet Union. All the free world was against that resolution. This time, this attack on Israel was, if not led by the Western world, but fully supported by the Western world. The Premier of Ireland, she was the chairman of this conference. Practical representatives of every country of the West was in one or another way were expressing their solidarity with this approach, that Israel is the symbol of the racism today. So that was the first change when it became clear that something very serious is happening in the free world in supporting extreme attacks on Israel. Then there started the so-called Second Intifada, and I want to remind you, it's almost immediately, a few months after 9/11, all the free world is under the attack of the global terrorism. And we in Israel feel that we are on the forefront of this global attack, and almost every week there is, almost every day, there is another terrorist suicide bomber who is killing another 10 Israelis in the center of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv. And at these very days, I am traveling in the campuses in America, and we are dealing with many politicians in the free world, and Israel is under the constant attack for its terrorism against Palestinians. I remember the cartoon in Independence, liberal newspaper, Independent, and there is a cartoon of Ariel Sharon eating Palestinian kids. Blood is dropping from his mouth. And he says, what's the problem? Did you see a politician kissing the babies? And well, in Israel, there was a big protest. It was meant to say, that's anti-Semitism today. Next week, after this cartoon was getting the special prize in England as the best cartoon of the year. We continue our criticism, and then European Union gives to this the prize of the best cartoon of the year in Europe. I went to London, I met with the cartoonist, and I said, don't you feel that that is the anti-Semitism? Just now there is on a TV serial from Lebanon, or Al-Manar is Hezbollah station, and then they show big how Jews are cutting the throats of the babies and using their blood for the matzah. And they show it big, but they're clearly anti-Semitic. He says, of course it's anti-Semitic. I said, don't you see that you're appealing to the same feelings? He said, absolutely not. How dare you to think we are such a civilized people? All my friends are or Jewish or very sympathetic to Jews. How can you think that when I'm drawing this cartoon expressing my protest against Israeli policy that we are anti-Semites? And then, of course, there was clear, again and again, new wave of clear double standard towards Israel in the international bodies. And I remember I came to speak to the head of the Committee on Human Rights in the United States, Louise Arbour, who was, by the way, extremely respectable and good lawyer and judge from Canada. And I said, don't even just look what's happening now in the world. There is Chechnya, and there is Darfur, and what's happening in China with all these genocidal wars. And the only question which is permanently on the agenda, officially, by law, permanently on the agenda of your committee is Israel-Palestinian problem. Don't you think that it's kind of discrimination against Israel, or it's double standard? And she said, you know, you're right, I feel very uncomfortable with it, but it doesn't depend on me. You know what? That there is special agreement between Russia and countries of the third world that Chechnya will not be on the agenda, and Russia agrees that Darfur will be on the agenda. And she explained me about all the conflicts, why the countries agreed to take it out of the agenda. So the only conflict that nobody is against, everybody agrees that it should be constant on the agenda, is Israel. And I said, you know what? In Russia, I lived in the country which had in the Tsarist Russia. I didn't live there, but I had a book with 1,000 laws which are different for Jews and for non-Jews, about taxes, about where to live, how to study, and so on. And you know, they were very logical explanations. And some even Russian intellectuals were explaining why it is logical, that they don't agree with this, but there is historical reason behind it. It didn't make it less anti-Semitic. Solzhenitsyn wrote a big book about 200 years between Russia and Jews, explaining logically why there were some restrictions for Jews. It didn't make it, the fact that it was logical doesn't make it less anti-Semitic. It means that it was clear double standard, logical. Here now, what you're explaining me, there is very double towards Israel, which has its logical explanation. But that's exactly what I'm saying. So, summarizing all this, I was looking for the way how to show that there is deep connection between modern attacks on Israel and classical anti-Semitism. And it was very easy to see that demonization was a tool against Jews for thousands of years. As Sartre said that for anti-Semite, Jew is the closest to evil. I heard in Russia many things about Jews connected to devil, all these old stories about Jews drinking the blood or spoiling the wells. And it all goes to the modern days to the Nazism, and with all the demonization of Jews. Demonization is a typical tool. Another typical tool is delegitimization. Delegitimization that Jews are not a religion because it's replaced by new religion. It was the Jews are not a nation, and Stalin wrote a special article while Jews are not a nation. From today, we hear more and more often that Israel as a state is not really a legitimate state. And again, from whom I hear it? I hear it, of course, we hear it from Muslim fundamentalists. And, but when I hear it from French intellectuals who are explaining me then in Europe why East and East and West and West, and it was very natural, it was to impose on the world this entity, modern Jewish democratic state in the Middle East. And that's why the way how it was created, and the reason why it is extremely problematic. So the only state about which there is a serious debate whether it is legitimate or not is Israel. And the third, and in fact, delegitimization is the point of double standard, in fact. And double standard, of course, attitude towards Jews as to the other in Europe was for 1,000 years. All the Jews were exiled from practically every country in Europe in different periods of history. There was special double standard in laws, whether it is in Tsarist Russia or Nazi Germany and so on. Here today, just example which I brought about United Nations, that's clear double standard, even of the most respectable institutions who don't even think about it, but they apply different standards to this. And then, in fact, I could deal with 2 Ds because the legitimization part of double standard. But I really wanted 3 Ds. Why 3 Ds? Because I was saying there are 3D films. And if you come to 3D film and don't have 3D spectacles, you will not understand what's happening. So I propose you 3 Ds about anti-Semitism. Look, if there is a double standard, or delegitimization, or demonization of Israel, these are exactly the tools which were used against Jews. But now, because it is collective Jew, it is used against them. So my idea was, let's introduce the 3 Ds, let's remember, let's compare it all the time, and that will help us. Well, I don't know if I would be able to convince public opinion because the idea of any connection between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism was really very unpopular. But I found a very good ally, Joschka Fischer, who was foreign minister of Germany, who was, in fact, he started as practically as an anarchist, almost terrorist on the left. He had some connections with Bader Meinhof. But then he, under the influence of events like Entebbe, became very much against all this radical activity, became the head of Green Party, and then became the foreign minister of Germany. And of course, he was much more to the left from me, but he had a very big sympathy towards Jews and Israel. And he happened to be in Israel just during the Delphinarium terrorist act when 20 young Jews were killed. And he was just there, and he said, I'll do everything to help you to fight against this new hatred towards Israel. And here is Berlin Conference in 2004 of Organization of Security and Cooperation Europe. Germany is the host. Our president is welcoming. Joschka Fischer gave me double time than to any other delegation to speak exactly about 3Ds. I gave all my theory of 3Ds. I gave many examples from today's Europe, and there were some delegates who supported this idea. Some who didn't. But then in the declaration, the final notes of this conference, it was written for the first time, they were the words that a number of delegations explained how criticism of Israel can become anti-Semitic. And at the same time, you want to say that criticism of Israel, like all the other countries, is legitimate. So it looks like a very careful word. But for the first time in the international document, it was said that, yes, some criticism of Israel can become new anti-Semitism. And in fact, then I followed it in State Department, in the Senate, where there was convened Committee on the Cooperation and Security in Europe. And 3Ds became like accepted idea of connecting between new anti-Semitism and old anti-Semitism. And later, when finally the work of a number of lawyers, but I have to mention Dina Parat, Yehuda Bauer, and Kenneth Stern, they formally built this definition where they put on a lot of examples, because how you can formulate the new anti-Semitism simply in words. So they're giving examples. What can be interpreted as an anti-Semitism. And among the 11 examples, 5 are exactly about demonization, delegitimization, and double standard towards Israel. So that's the situation for today. One more modern example, which of course is in everybody's minds, is BDS. And there are many attempts today to say that BDS has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. If you use this criteria, first of all, founders of BDS are denying the right of Israel to exist. And if you read the documents of ISGAP, you can get, or the Israeli Ministry on strategic studies, you can see there many examples of quotes how the founders of BDS are denying the right of Israel to exist. But you know what? Those who are participating in BDS is not only founders. There are many well-wishing young people. Then you can remind them, what about double standard? Why you are applying this web tool of boycott to Israel, but there is such a long line of the countries who can be definitely boycotted before if you are applying the same principle to all the other countries. And that can show us how this tool can be used, to put these spectacles and to watch and to see the real picture. Now, as to the restrictions on freedom of speech, I would say absolutely the opposite. If you really, if you have a clear borders of the anti-Semitism, you know these borders, so inside these borders, you can be as free in your criticism of Israel as possible. One of my students in Shalem made a special work on this, applying of these principles. He applied them to the criticism on Sabra and Shatila. And Sabra and Shatila was unfortunately a very tragic example of how the criticism of Israel, comparing it with Nazis and the most awful massive killing by Jews in history and so on, how it was really, by my 3D principles, was a classical new antisemitism. But in the same work, he showed how people could criticize Israel without crossing these lines, how they could criticize Ariel Sharon, why he permitted Christians in the camp, and how Israel government, why he didn't have control of Ariel Sharon not to let him do it. And this criticism, that's what brought to Wadat Granat, to serious studies, and to the conclusions. So the moment, if you want to be constructive in your criticism, to the contrary, the moment you remove all these demonization elements, and then there is no suspicion that your real aim is destruction of the state, then your criticism can be very constructive. When you're speaking about apartheid, nobody in Israel will take seriously your criticism. To the contrary, and we know that it brings only to the hatred to the Jews and to the full denial of us in anything. But if it is criticism about what is really happening on checkpoints and why there are violations, and I heard myself in our ground from our Attorney General, very serious criticism. So that's something what can be taken into account. That's something what can be discussed on international and any other forum. So to the contrary, 3Ds gives you opportunity to see the anti-Semitism, but also to see a lot of room for constructive criticism. And that should be our approach also today.
Okay, Natan, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. So I'm going to start off the conversation with a couple of questions and comments, and then we'll open it up to people who are tuning in. If everybody sends your questions to me, I'll try to ask as many and collect as many and pass it on to Natan. So Natan, your work on fighting contemporary anti-Semitism and the delegitimization or using the 3Ds to fight for the Jewish people's rights and for Israel's right has been very effective. And in a sense, I would argue in the West, the front line has been the universities, not just the campus politics, but actually what's taking place in the classroom. How philosophically and ideologically mainstream education questions the Jewish notions of peoplehood, as well as our right to self-determination in our homeland. And going back to this struggle for Soviet Jewry, you galvanized an entire movement. You became a symbol of not only the human rights struggle and the struggle for the Soviet Jews in the Soviet Union, you became a symbol, I think, for the Jewish people, a symbol of the struggle for our freedom. And as we face this struggle today, in this generation, I just want to say, when I was a kid in Montreal, I was active in the USY, and I remember we used to meet Sunday nights, and we used to have calls to Soviet Jews through the telephone, which were very momentous events. And after my engagement in the USY, I became the chairperson of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry at McGill in Montreal. And I'm mentioning this because I think, in a sense, this was my first experience fighting for human rights, fighting for Jewish rights. And I think it galvanized an entire generation. All of my friends, all of my parents who are listening today, my parents and all of their friends, my grandparents and all of their friends were engaged in defending the rights of Jewish people in the former Soviet Union, defending Israel's right to exist, and defending our rights in the West, in Canada and in North America and in Europe. The students, I find the students are sort of on their own. The professors and faculty are on their own. How do you see this sort of onslaught? Your analysis of the 3Ds is instrumental in understanding the attack against Jewish people, against Israel, but also Jewish communities in the diaspora. The IHRA definition is an important tool to fight back. How can our community, how can the business community, the housewives and the students that fought so gallantly in the struggle for Soviet Jews, how can we create a movement in our community that takes seriously the miseducation of another generation of people in the West who are learning to question Israel's right to exist, if not call for its elimination? And as Abraham Lincoln said, what the students study in this generation becomes the policy of the next generation. How can we galvanize our community to take very seriously what's happening in our educational institutions? Because I would argue, I don't think our community really sees this as part of the real world or as the real threat. And I would argue what's happening in the university is the most important institution in our democracy. How do we galvanize our community to take this struggle in the university and on our campuses more seriously?
Well, first of all, I agree with you that what's happening in American universities is very alarming. In fact, 20 years ago, 18 years ago, when I came back from my first round of visits to American and Canadian universities, I told to Ariel Sharon that I believe that the main battlefield for the future of Jewish people is universities, is the campuses. because then I saw this awful contrast between what's happening in Israel fighting the terror and what's happening with Jewish students on the campuses who are ashamed of being associated with Israel. Second, about Soviet Union, we have to understand what really changed and why we were so successful then and what is the problem today. In Soviet Union, you are absolutely right. The struggle was, we Soviet Jews could never survive in our struggle even one day if it wasn't struggle of all the Jews of the world. Student struggle for Soviet Jewry, that's maybe one of the most world organizations for us was. You know, the KGB was saying to me in prison many times, who you think is supporting you? They're only a bunch of students and housewives. But that was exactly the great definition which they gave to our movement. These Jewish students and Jewish housewives in thousands and hundreds of thousands with their demonstration, with their pressure, with their demands to their politicians, they saved us. So no doubt that this international mobilization of Jews was very important. But what helped, what was working with, there were two very clear values which these young Jews had. One value was value of freedom, democracy, human rights. Many of them, by the way, those who joined our movement, they came straight from Martin King's fighting, straight from Atlanta and other places, and joined student struggle for Soviet Jewry. So it was clear that the value of freedom is absolute value, and whenever you're fighting for against totalitarian regimes, you're doing something very good. And young Jews were happy to join the struggle. And the second, of course, the feeling of the belonging, of rediscovered identity. Many Jews, American Jews who, like you, were coming to us, to Moscow to help, they were saying how by joining the struggle, they rediscovered their own roots, how happy they are that they are part of Jewish people. So these two feelings of identity and of value of freedom were playing very important role in that generation. Now, I remember soon after I was released, I read the book of Alan Bloom, I think professor of Chicago University, Closing of American Mind. And I became really concerned because, as you said, the students of today will be the intellectual leaders of tomorrow. And there he was explaining how American students are taught that there is no value in freedom, that in fact there are no absolute values, that everything is relative, that you should not be ready to die for anything. And that's one thing. And that's something what became stronger and stronger and stronger, this postmodern attitude that everything is relative and that there is no value in fighting against dictatorship, supporting democratic dissidents and so on. The other thing is the value of identity, that this feeling of assimilation, the feeling that, well, as I heard from, I'm a Jew, but for many years we were in misery and the world was helping us. Now I'm a Jew by helping to the other people. Why I have to invest in my own people? It's against my liberal ideal of Jew. So and I have to remind again and again to these young people, if you really want to change the world, you want to do a better place, the only source of your strength is in your roots, in your family, in your community, in your identity. So the fact that in this postmodern Western liberal Europe, and now also America, to the extent that American universities are really reflecting the atmosphere in Europe, it became very decadent, with no values of belonging and with no value of fighting for real values of freedom. And that's very dangerous in general, and especially for us, for Jews, but it is defining elements of our solidarity. So I think the answer is you cannot really succeed in facing challenges of today, and no doubt that new and old antisemitism and assimilation are two big challenges for Jewish people. You can't succeed in it if you're not strengthening our bonds and well, I will not start mentioning birthrights and the others. Without connection, only two things can help our people, our faith and Zionism. Connection to our tradition, to our community, and connection to the state of Israel. That's why we have to work on.
So thank you. There's many questions and follow-up things that you inspiring me to think about. But I want to shift gears for a moment. You mentioned Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement was very much supportive of the struggle for Soviet Jews. And there was a bond, I'd say, between the American Jewish community and the civil rights movement and with Israel and the struggle for Soviet Jews, the condemnation of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism in the African American community. Given what's happening in the United States in the past week in the news, but more, I'd say more structurally, the marginalization of the African American community, the racism, the police brutality, from your perspective in this moment, what do you think is our responsibility to this problem of racism in the United States? And what should our leadership be doing vis-a-vis the African American community and trying to reach out to them in their hour of need?
Well, first of all, it's awful. It's tragic even to see these pictures which we see on TV in Israel from New York, and to think that now New York, besieged by Corona and besieged by this violence and the real war between police and black people, it's awful. It's heartbreaking. Second, it didn't start today. And we Jews permitted to take the ban of human rights from us as if Zionism and human rights is two different things. And our enemies used it against us. And well, that's another topic, but very important topic that we should never permit it, and we should do everything to take this ban back. Third, America, Jews always were sympathetic and supportive of the fight of black people, and we have to continue being. At the same time, we had always to make it clear that violence is not part of our game that we are involved. I think our movement was so successful because it was non-violent. It was against violence. And when Kahana, who has deserves a lot of credit for being one of the first voices on our behalf, but when he started using violence, we Soviet Jews from Moscow sent a letter saying how dangerous it is because it undermines the very moral principles on which all our struggles are. So I think even in this difficult hour, we should not compromise on this, that violence has nothing to do with the fight for real justice and human rights in democracy. And the third, of course, while we have to build bridges with the black community, not by accepting these formulas of intersectionalism and the new antisemitism. When Black Lives Matter, it has a real challenge today, and we can sympathize and express our solidarity with the demand that Black Lives Matter no less than white lives. But when Black Lives Matter as an organization, from its very first steps, took on its banner the new anti-Semitism, and when their main slogan was from Furgenson to Gaza, meaning that from attacks on black people to attacks by Israel and Palestine, there is no difference. And some of Jewish organizations were saying that in order to participate in the great struggle for justice and against racism, we have to close the eyes of these anti-Semitic elements inside. I think it was awful compromise, and we have to be very clear on this. All our sympathy is with the black people who suffer from injustice. There should be no compromise with the attempts to connect the struggle for the rights of the black with the new anti-Semitism. And we should never be part of any violent attempts to restore justice in the free world through violence.
Thank you. No, there was some research that we did at ISGAP that showed the this meme from Ferguson to Gaza was actually introduced by the Nation of Islam, and they were trying to.
But that's the problem, that all this these talented haters of Israel who want to destroy Israel are coming with the slogans which are appropriate for feminist movement, and which are appropriate for gay rights movement, and which are appropriate for the black movement. And we have to be the first to warn that there is a clear line, that you cannot expect any support of human rights world if you're mixing these two things. And unfortunately, we are not very good on this. Not when I say we, I mean all the Jewish world. There are some Jewish organizations who are very good on, but when Linda Sarsour turned the feminist movement and the anti-Israel movement, there were some Jewish organizations who said, "At Khan, we are not ready to be part of it," and some Jewish organizations who said, "Well, but the feminist struggle is so important that I'll go with it anyway." And that is, we have to be morally very clear on these issues.
I agree. Thank you. So we have I'm going to open it up to some questions. We have a question from Turkey, from Natan Sharansky. And he asks, it's almost 5 years since IHRA accepted the anti-Semitism definition, I guess in Europe. During these years, some 35 to 40 countries and organizations throughout the world accepted it. But as we know, it's not a binding definition. And as you know, no country or organization has really implemented it. And we see no one has made steps towards formal implementation. But the idea behind this definition was implementation. So Metin's question is, why is it not implemented? What other steps should IHRA or other organizations do to bring about its implementation as a binding law?
First of all, there is implementation, meaning that a number of states not only passed this resolution, but they established a special body monitoring the old and new anti-Semitism based on those, let's say, a little bit vague criteria which are formulated. And I don't think that they can be not vague. I just tried to explain before, one Supreme Court judge in America said, when he was asked to define pornography, he said, "When I see pornography, I know that that's pornography." So he said there is no way to describe it by clear definition, but I can identify it. And what I was just saying, that if you have these 3D spectacles on our eyes, using this definition, we can always see this antisemitism. So there are bodies and there are people who are responsible for implementing this. But I have to say, IHRA, after all, IHRA is the organization for Holocaust remembrance. So how we can learn from the past, what we have to teach in our schools, how we can bring more youth to Auschwitz in order they will remember it, what kind of lessons on tolerance. That's in fact the ideas. It so happened that the relative was pushing, and many organizations were involved in this debate. And so it became the first who put it on their side and voted for this was IHRA, and kol hakavod to IHRA, but it cannot solve this problem. That's the problem. The antisemitism, the most ancient hatred. So it seems that people need kind of scapegoat, the other to hate. So, and it is very dangerous for civilizations. Today, this collective Jew, Israel is such a target, and it's permanent effort of different parts of the society on different levels, on political level, on educational level, in a social level, in media level. And yeah, I agree that there are many failures, maybe even more failures than achievements. But the very fact that that is a threat to the civilized world, and not only to Jews. In fact, Jews are the only ones who learned how to live with antisemitism and survive with antisemitism. But the world civilization is in danger, and I think it's understood again and again and again in different ways. And now I hope we are in the stage when where this hatred can take us is understood better than a few years ago, definitely better than 5 years ago.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, there's definitely a shift. I think more people accept these connections that we're all trying to make.
For sure. Yeah.
So we have a question from Sweden, from Saskia Pantel, who's she is the president of the Zionist Federation of Sweden. And she says, thank you so much for all the work you're doing, Natan. In Sweden, using the 3Ds and the IHRA definition are crucial to having hate crimes being labeled as anti-Semitic. But we are losing because all is considered legitimate anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionist crimes, and it's not being labeled as hate crimes. So anti-Zionism is sort of politically acceptable. For example, there were 20 men who attacked a synagogue with Molotov cocktails when Jewish youth were having a Hanukkah party. And this was only labeled as an arsonist attack and not an anti-Semitic attack. After Trump announced that the embassy was moving to Jerusalem, there was an outbreak of anti-Semitism. So it was viewed as critical of the United States and Israeli policy, but was not viewed as anti-Semitism, even though synagogues were attacked. Saskia's question is, how do we fight this? How are we are too few and we're only volunteers, and people, she's saying, are scared to speak up. Even if we do try to educate people about the 3Ds and the IHRA definition, if attacked, we won't, even if we're protected by the law. So there is a fear, and I think the fear seems Sweden has a smaller Jewish community and the challenges are serious. But I think we can extrapolate that there is fear in North America too, among faculty and students and leaders, feminists, Jewish women who are part of the feminist movement, to speak out. So how do we overcome this, and how do we overcome this fear, which you've written about and lived, not in fear, and how do we get organized more effectively?
Well, first of all, I do know also Sweden Jewish community is really very small community, and which has to face a very difficult postmodern world of decadent world of people who don't want to fight for anything to defend any values, and who are upset that Israel, because Israel insists to be a Jewish state, it irritates so many Arabs, and as a result, we have our problems in Sweden. So, and there are good examples which were given about these people. I think it was in Malmö, I don't remember, where these hooligans were attacking synagogue. But I can give you the same type of examples from France, when clearly anti-Semitic killing of the Jew was at the moment it was raised question, well, it's not proof that it's anti-Semitism, it's different pretexts were said not to call it an antisemitism. And the only way what helped to change the public opinion, it was to show to the public in France how it is dangerous, not for Jews, how it is dangerous, this permissiveness for the stability of French society. And again, anti-Semitism is very high, all the new anti-Semitism in France, but the awareness and understanding what are the consequences for the future of France. And I spoke with a number of intellectuals in France, and I see how they are more and more concerned. They're saying, well, you're correctly concerned about the future of Jewish people. I'm concerned about what will be with our French culture, which we will not stop it. And then, and by the way, in the specific case that I mentioned, then as a result of influence of public opinion, politicians also change their attitude. So we don't have any other argument except for the fact that it's not our Jewish problem. Of course, if it becomes impossible, okay, we always have our choice. And I want to remind Sweden Jews, they also have a choice to come to Israel, of course. But it is a danger for the stability of the normal democratic civilian Swedish society. And the fact that so many people don't understand it, the more high will be the price which they'll pay in the future. So there is no other way. First of all, we have to strengthen our own feeling of identity and moral justice of opposition. We have to be strong. And second, we have to find as many allies or people concerned about the future of Sweden among non-Jews as possible.
Thank you. We have a question from Professor Abebe Zagaya. He says, thank you for your presentation. And he says, what is missing in your analysis is that Arab states are using the Palestinian cause for internal political purposes. Palestinians are being treated as second-class citizens by Arab governments. So how does that factor into this global?
First of all, it's not missing from my analysis, but I spoke longer than I was supposed to. So I definitely agree with the person who is asking this question. Unfortunately, I saw it firsthand many times that, in fact, the real plight of Palestinians doesn't concern the Arab dictators and sometimes even broader public opinion. And while dealing with democratic dissidents in many Arab countries, and some of my colleagues and friends, Palestinian democratic dissidents, are among them, they always felt that the real plight, let's take feminists, this feminist movement which is fighting in America for the rights of Palestinian people. Do they care about the fact that 1/3 of all killed in Palestinian society is honored killings, are women? Are they concerned about it? When I was speaking on American campuses, coming together with a gay person from Palestinian Authority who was explaining that he had a choice to become a suicide bomber or to run away to Jerusalem to ask for asylum. That was the choice which Hamas was giving him. I have to say, was it of any concern for any pro-Palestinian student society on American campus? But it's also a more general question. Badawi, the clear case of Saudi Arabian democratic dissident, political prisoner, punished in front of all the world. I personally told, I was the head of Jewish Institute, all our shlichim on the campus, all representatives of the campuses, participate in all the demonstrations which Arab students will do on behalf of Badawi. We have to express solidarity with those Arabs whose human rights are violated. 2 weeks after this, I asked, did you participate? They said, no, there was not a one demonstration, not a one Muslim organization of the campus who expressed any interest to support his rights. So, specific to your question, yeah, I think the fact that 5th generation of Palestinians live in the refugee camps and not in normal housing, it's because the Palestinian leaders and Arab world wants to use them as a battle ram against Israel and are not really concerned at all about their conditions, their rights, situation with women, the development, and so on. So yes, it is a big problem. It's a problem in general in the Arab world, but as the one who's analyzing the problems of the Western world, I think that Western world has finally to understand that their real allies in the Arab world are those who are concerned with the plight, with the real fate of Palestinians, with their suffering because of the lack of freedom, with the suffering of the women in Arab countries because of honored killings and so on, and not those dictators who, in order to keep stable their own regimes, are using Palestinians as a pretext for their oppressions.
So Natan, we're running low on time, so I'm going to ask you one final question. It's from Howard Morey. Howard Morey says his son Josh Morey played a crucial role in creating safe speech policy on campuses to fight BDS by demonstrating how BDS groups breach these policies by targeting students who support Israel, who call Jewish students racist or for supporting the apartheid Israel. After a campaign to educate the student council, his university decertified campus BDS groups. On other campuses, students have used these safe space policies and the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism to undermine the BDS groups. In your view, are we winning the war against BDS and anti-Semitism on campus?
Well, first of all, I welcome and glad to hear about all the efforts which the students are doing. I think it's not only fight for the future of Jewish people, as I said to Ariel Sharon 20 years ago, but it's one of the biggest threats to American democracy, to the leader of the free world, that the campuses, step by step, are becoming the place where the free speech is restricted, if not prohibited. If you take, it started from not prohibiting to pro-Zionist speakers. But if you look now on the long list of the speakers who were prevented to speak on the campuses, many of them are non-Jews, many of them were not going to speak about Israel or Zionism. But the moment you decide that you have the power to not to let the people who disagree with you to speak in the university, that you have a moral power and physical power, that's the end of real freedom of speech and all the democratic process in America. And if it will end in America, it will disappear from this world, maybe except from Israel. So it is the most important struggle, free speech on the university. Now, I don't know to say whether we win or lose. It depends on the definition. But as I was always saying to our shlichim, our representatives whom we were sending to the campuses in America, I was saying, you know what? Your aim is not to convince those who hate Israel that we are better than they think. Your aim is to convince young Jews on the campus that they have no reason to be ashamed of Israel. They have all the reasons to be proud of this connection. And the same can be said in general about students. There are many people who are prejudiced and who don't want to live enjoying the freedom of speech for everybody. But everybody who changed this opinion, everybody who joined the struggle for the freedom of speech, it's a victory. It's a victory for the America. And let's count it like this. You succeeded on one campus, on two, on three campuses. It's huge. It's a big success. And it's part of our general success.
Natan, thank you very much for your time and participating in the webinar. And on behalf of everybody at ISGAP, we really appreciate you taking the time today and all your efforts to help direct and develop ISGAP. So thank you.
And thank you, ISGAP, for all your important work which you are doing in academia with the professors of the universities. It's very important. Thank you, everybody.
And it's also interesting how, when I was a young student fighting for the freedom of Soviet Jews and you were in prison, it's amazing how, history, things change. Now you're a free man in our homeland in Israel, and you're helping us struggle with contemporary anti-Semitism in the West. So I think you embody a lot of hope and a powerful hope for us. So
thank you. Well, it was easy to feel yourself free man when you are in a Soviet prison. It's much more challenging to keep your freedom when you are in America.
Why? Tell me why.
Well, because you have many choices. In in prison, I say no to KGB, and by this I fulfilled all my moral obligations. We Jews have Taryag Mitzvot, 613 obligations. Can you imagine somebody who fulfills all these 613 obligations? It's practically impossible. But in prison, everything comes to one. You say no to KGB, you have overcome your fear, and that's it. By this, you are a moral person. You made all your choices. In the free world, you have so many choices and so many temptations and so many compromises to be made or not to be made. So you're never sure that is it okay that you will agree on this compromise or not. So the fight in the Soviet Union, the dictatorship was complete, but your feeling of inner freedom was also complete. The free world here, we have to fight for our inner freedom all the time with our fears, with our temptations, with our desires not to undermine our career by being involved in this or that. And so it's very good to have such a compass, such a criteria as I had in prison, to go back to that past and to understand what is really important in this life.
This is a good topic of conversation. I was just speaking with my rabbi, Akiva Zweig, about the 4 exiles in Judaism. So we have Egypt, the slavery, Babylon, annihilation, the Greeks, assimilation. And in Edom in Rome, we have all of the different challenges in this exile. So yeah, there's a lot to draw on from our wisdom.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everything. And everybody who's listening, thank you for attending. And on Wednesday at 11 a.m. New York time, we'll continue with Dr. Arnon Gross and David Bodine on UNRWA and their role in supporting anti-Semitism and education. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.